Well, we do have an escalation in the situation regarding the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, originally, it was announced after a few years where it seemed like the Jaguars might be on the verge of relocation. It was announced the multi-billion-dollar rebuild to their stadium. They have one of the worst stadiums in the NFL. And the price tag on this with the fully translucent roof was $2 billion. It just got announced and then it came out. There were murmurs that it was going to be half publicly funded, half privately funded. And we just got a poll from a few days ago polling about 400 potential voters, and just 6% said they would be willing to foot a 50-50 bill with the Jacksonville Jaguars and pay upwards of $1 billion in tax money to this massive stadium renovation. And it's not just the stadium, it's also the surrounding area. They want to create a stadium district. So their plan was Shad Khan would pay, who's the Jaguars owner, he'd pay $1 billion, the taxpayers would pay $1 billion, 6% support that. And now we've got this, and this really shouldn't surprise anyone. Jaguars move to London, gains more steam with $1 billion relocation threat by NFL team. The Jaguars keep threatening to leave their home in Jacksonville, Florida. This time, a strong public threat has a new $1 billion price tag attached to it, and that's the whole idea. They're demanding or saying that the public needs to pay $1 billion in tax money to fund this renovation. I don't think the Jaguars would move to London. It just doesn't make sense logistically, so I'm guessing that's just kind of a clickbaity headline. Like, we can understand the Jaguars threatening relocation, but I wouldn't say, oh, you know, they're possibly going to London. I think it would possibly be Austin, Texas. There was a rumor that if the Bills were not able to come up with the funds to fund a new stadium, they would be moving to Austin, Texas. So I think the top two locations for the Jaguars would be Austin, Texas, or Toronto, Canada. You can see it says, in the aftermath of a poll that showed little public support for $1 billion in taxpayer money for stadium renovations, the Jaguars have begun dropping not-so-subtle hints about potentially leaving town. If there's a referendum, the ballot question should be, do you want to keep the NFL in Jacksonville? Jaguars CEO Mark Lamping said at the AXS Drive conference located in St. Louis, the current plan circumvents the ballot box because, frankly, any public vote for free money for American oligarchs will fail, regardless of how they frame the proposition. So he's coming out and he's saying you need to change what the question is on the ballot, you know, from would you be willing to pay $1 billion, half and half with the Jaguars? Would you be willing to pay $500 million, which also only had 12% of the support, by the way? He's saying they need to change the question, and this is do or die. You're either going to pay the $1 billion, the general public's either going to pay the $1 billion in stadium renovations, or they're leaving. That's what he wants the question to be framed as, and the original poll was conducted by the University of North Florida, showed only 6% of Jacksonville residents favor paying for the $1 billion renovation, and 47% don't care if the Jaguars will move without the money. So 47% don't even care if the Jaguars will move. I thought I saw a poll that said 83% of the people in Jacksonville want to keep the team, you know, local. You can see, quote, look, if Jacksonville loses an NFL team, they're never going to get another one. And if the Jaguars have to relocate from Jacksonville, those of us that went down there would have failed. And so it does seem like a legitimate threat. I think the initial thought was always this would have to be readjusted. There's going to have to be somewhere they can meet in the middle, you would think. It's not going to be $1 billion. You're not going to go half and half, especially with just 6% in terms of support. You know, you could, even saying, you know, we will leave if you don't support this, 47% of the people say they don't even care if the Jaguars leave or not. So it's a tough situation right now in Jacksonville. I think there's going to have to be compromise. I think there might have to be maybe another private minority owner brought into this to help fund this. if, the Jaguars owner doesn't want to fund the entire thing, or, I mean, obviously he's not funding the entire thing, but even $1 billion, you would think maybe if they can negotiate with the public, bring it down to $500 million in terms of public money. Obviously, you would love to see the ownership pay for the entire thing, but their argument is that the city of Jacksonville owns Everbank Stadium, and that is why they should pay for some of the renovations. Really, it doesn't even matter. This is just kind of how these things work in general. They're always going to want public money pretty much no matter what, but this is a legitimate threat here brought by the Jaguars CEO. And he's basically said, no, we're not budging. We want the public to pay $1 billion, and we will also pay $1 billion in terms of that. Also, when it comes to the Jaguars' potential stadium rebuild, it's a logistics nightmare in terms of where the Jaguars are actually going to play as the rebuild is going on, because they can't play in their stadium. You wouldn't think. There was the idea that they could potentially play in their stadium during construction, but construction would be spread out over 4 years, not just the 2 years, and also it would cost an extra $100 or $200 million, which right now I don't think they can afford. Remember, this is a $2 billion project already. The stadium rebuild itself is around $1.4 billion. It is basically the cost of a brand new MLB stadium, because the translucent roof and the chrome that surrounds it that they want to put into it is so expensive. They're really not even changing the seating layout at all. The upper deck is going to remain the same. The lower bowls are going to remain the same. They're just adding stuff onto it, and then also changing the pool area, and certainly upgrading the interior. I'm not saying they're not going to do that. They're putting in new exclusive suites. They're putting in new, seats right next to the field. But overall, it's going to be the same type of shell that is Everbank Stadium. And then when it comes to them potentially moving somewhere else in 2026 and 2027, you're looking at maybe Orlando, Florida, maybe the University of Florida as options, because I know the Florida University is getting a massive renovation on their stadium. Probably maybe in 2024, 2025, they will be getting a big renovation there. Also, Camping World Stadium is trying to get a renovation. So there's a lot of stuff up in the air right now about this Jaguars stadium renovation. And we knew it would be a war. This is how these things work. It gets announced, it's going to happen, and then you actually need the money. And if it's not 100% privately funded, they're never locks. They're never locks to happen unless you have just a crazy rabid fan base in terms of, NFL fan base or whatever. Jacksonville is really not that. I'm not saying Jacksonville has a bad football fan base, but when you talk about the best fan bases in the NFL, the city of Jacksonville is not number one on the list. Again, I'm not hating on that. I'm not saying, oh yeah, they should 100% pay for a billionaire stadium. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying just in general, Jacksonville, this is why they've been talked about, potentially relocating for so long now. It's like a 7 or 8 year saga that kind of went away when this was announced. Now it's back on the table because they have the leverage and they can say we're in a terrible stadium, we can leave soon. This is the whole idea of trying to get as much public money as possible, because they're going to leverage the idea that they will relocate if the public does not pay $1 billion. Again, there's going to have to be some compromise here. Even though it was just 400 voters that were polled, 6% support is just not even close in terms of, like, if it was at 25 or 30%, you could say, okay, give it a few months, throw out a threat, it'll get brought up. But you've got the Jaguars CEO coming out and saying the question on the ballot needs to be changed, because if the public doesn't put up $1 billion for this, if we don't get $1 billion in taxpayer money, we will be relocating and going somewhere else. And then the question becomes, is it London? Is it Austin, Texas? Is it Toronto, Canada? I don't think it can be London, personally, just based off the fact that you would need at least 2 teams. I've gone in depth about this. You would need at least 2 teams, maybe 4 teams in London to actually make that work in terms of travel. You'd be playing block schedules. You'd be staying in Europe, facing all those teams, then going to the States for 3 or 4 straight weeks, facing all those teams, then going back. Just putting one team there, it would be so hard, and that team would be at such a disadvantage in terms of free agency, because no one would want to play and deal with that time zone difference. It's like you'd have to give them more in terms of salary cap, because it would just be such a burden on all those players to fly back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean if there's just one team in London. Even if there's two teams, it just doesn't seem like the NFL can do that right now. If a relocation does happen, I'd say Austin, Texas, or Toronto. But again, we'll have to see how this continues to develop, because these things tend to happen all the time. There'll be a timeline. They'll say we're doing this renovation. They'll release all the renderings. They'll bring, they'll start polling people, taking people's opinion. What is the public thinking? If the public is willing to pay for it, it moves forward. If they're not, you start hearing the threats of relocation. Normally, these situations, I'd say 90% of the time, do get solved without relocation. But this is certainly one where it's like, if the Jaguars relocate from Jacksonville, is anyone really good? It's not like this is a historic franchise, So it wouldn't really surprise me, especially with the last 7 or 8 years and how the dialogue has been around there. But we will see. Maybe the owner will up the money and say we're staying in Jacksonville. But again, you do also have that logistical problem where they're going to have to leave Jacksonville basically no matter what for 2 years, because their stadium needs to be rebuilt. And if they're rebuilding it on the exact same area, they need a new stadium to play in. And unfortunately, within the city of Jacksonville, you have a soccer stadium that's being built now, but it's only going to seat about 10,000 people. So unless you rapidly expand the seating on that and try and play at that soccer stadium in Jacksonville or play at the University of North Florida, which you would need at least $200 or $300 million in renovations on that stadium to play at, because it's completely decrepit, you're going to be looking at leaving Jacksonville, going to Orlando, going to possibly, they were talking about the NASCAR racetrack in Daytona. They were really throwing out a bunch of different ideas. But either way, we will have to see what happens when it comes to this open relocation threat by the Jaguars, demanding and saying, listen, the public's got to pay $1 billion or we are leaving the city. With the leverage that they do have in the lease coming up. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.